Okay, Revelation chapter 13. Now, of course, in order to make more sense of this, we just have to make a couple of statements about the last chapter, because chapter 12 actually started a brand new section in the book. And we looked at this chart last week when we began chapter 12, and the last half of the book of Revelation, which is chapters 12 through 22, is what we're calling Act 2 of the divine drama, of the divine play that's playing out before John's eyes. And so this last half will begin to introduce for us the background of all of the anti-Christian efforts in the world that's persecuting the church, that's killing the people of God here, and yet God showing us that victory is still His, and that we all will be vindicated as we're faithful to Christ to the end. So we're being introduced to the main opponents of Christianity. Now, chapter 12 just introduced us to the dragon. The dragon. Now, the dragon is identified by verse 9 as that serpent of old, the devil, Satan. So he's explicitly identified. So the devil is what is the main force behind all of the anti-Christian persecution. And if you remember in the first part, or rather in chapter 12, we said a good way to understand it is 3 strikes and you're out. He tried 3 different times to destroy God's purpose in the world of bringing Jesus into the world, of purchasing the church and saving men. So he was waiting for Jesus to be born, and then as soon as he was to be born, he wanted to devour him, and he failed at that, strike 1. He then, once Jesus was ascended to the right hand of God, he actually tried to barge into heaven and make war against Jesus in order to bring him down. And that's the picture of Revelation 12, 7 through 12. And he failed at that. Michael and his archangels fought and defended the reign of Christ. You know, this is the picturesque way in which John is picturing this. Well, he failed. That's strike 2. He was hurled to the earth, and there he began to persecute the woman who bore the child and her offspring. And so we're talking here about the purpose of God and the church that continues into the world. And so he begins to persecute them, and he's enraged and he's angry. But of course, the earth helps the woman, opens up its mouth, swallows the flood which the dragon spewed out of his mouth, and the dragon is even more enraged, and he goes off to make war with the rest of her offspring, those who keep the commandments of God and the testimony of Jesus. So chapter 12 leaves us where the devil is angry and enraged at the church, and he goes off to make war with them. Well, how is he going to do that, and how is that going to play out? Well, that's what the rest of the book is going to explain and give more detail concerning. So he's unable, we can look at the beginning of our notes now. In the Revelation 13 notes, the very first bullet point says, having been defeated by the Lord, that's what I just explained in chapter 12, Satan is unable to directly attack God's people on the earth, and so he now attempts to destroy the cause of Christ through hired emissaries in the form of 2 beasts. The beast from the sea, and that's the first 10 verses of chapter 13, and the beast from the earth, and that's verses 11 through 18, the rest of chapter 13. And so that's what I have represented here on the chart. So the dragon was cast out, and so unable to directly destroy the church, he hires what I'm calling 2 emissaries, hired servants to do his bidding. And they are pictured in the form of 2 great beasts, a sea beast and a land beast in chapter 13. That's what we're introduced to today. Now on your notes it says here that the beast from the earth, or the land beast, is going to be referred to in other passages simply as the false prophet. You'll see that in chapter 16 verse 13, chapter 19 verse 20, and chapter 20 and verse 10. It will say the great beast and the false prophet. The beast and false prophet. It's talking about this land beast, and that gives us a hint already that he's going to have a religious connotation. There's going to be a religious flavor to this land beast that will do the bidding of Satan. And so we're going to see how that plays out in chapter 13. Now, the second bullet point says, the beast of this vision represent the evil forces that were at work in the world against the persecuted saints. And so John is here setting the stage for the ultimate battle between good and evil forces. And this is this battle we've already seen in the first half of the book of Revelation, right? Where God's cause is persecuted, His people are put to death and martyred, and there's this great struggle between evil, anti-Christian sentiment and those who are trying to be faithful. And so there's no mystery there. The only mystery is what lies behind that battle, what lies behind these forces. And that's what we're reading in the last half of the book of Revelation. But chapter 13 is the introduction of Satan's henchmen, is what I'm calling them. I think I might have gotten that from Johnny Ramsey or one of my teachers a long time ago. But they are the henchmen of Satan, and they're hired to do his bidding in the world. And I have here that this is like an unholy Trinity, and it's almost as if it's a parody of the true, Trinity, the Godhead. And so the unholy Trinity would be Satan with these two beasts. And we'll see how this even makes more sense as we go through here, how they're almost trying to mock or parody the real Trinity in order to persuade people to follow them as we go through chapter 13. So I tell you what, let's read the first couple of verses of chapter 13 before we look at that last bullet point on our notes. So Revelation 13 verses 1 and 2 says, "Then he stood on the sand of the sea," speaking about the dragon that was just mentioned in the verse before it. So he's enraged, he's angry, he wants to persecute the church. He's unable to do it directly, and now chapter 13 opens by saying, so he's standing on the sea, and John says, "I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard, his feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority." Now the last bullet point there at the top of your note says, "A proper understanding of the identity of this beast is contingent on understanding Daniel chapter 7. Because this is what John sees. John sees the same thing Daniel saw, essentially. The same imagery is coming before John's eyes. And so, in fact, I have a picture up here on the screen that kind of gives an illustration of this whole chapter, where you see the dragon, and I've got a new feature here on my streaming service. Let's see if this works. So I've just zoomed in to the screen up there, and I don't know how clear it is. It may not be completely clear, but this is just a human drawing, an illustration of what we're reading here in chapter 13. So you see the fiery red dragon with the heads and the crowns and all of that there standing on the shore. Out of the water comes this strange amalgamation of a creature with all these heads and horns coming up out of the sea. Now out of the earth, which we'll read about later, is the beast behind them with the horns, the 2 horns, and it speaks, calls fire down from heaven, and it marks people on their foreheads and on their hands. And so this is a human illustration of that. But this beast here that we're talking about, the beast that is coming up out of the sea, is first seen by Daniel. So I want to go back and look at some of these images. Now you'll see again up here some of these beasts that are seen by Daniel. Now I'm going to read from Daniel chapter 7. So you'll have to go to Daniel 7, and let's notice what Daniel saw. If you look at chapter 7, verse 2, Daniel spoke, saying, "I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea." So he's by the sea as well. It says, 4 great beasts came up from the sea, each different from another. The first was like a lion with eagle's wings, and he goes on to describe that. Look at verse 5. And suddenly another beast, a second, like a bear. So those are illustrated there on your screen. Verse 6 says, after this I looked, and there was another beast like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. And then finally verse 7 says, and after this I saw in the night visions, behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong, huge iron teeth, devouring, breaking in pieces, trampling the residue with its feet, different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. So Daniel sees this 4th beast. He doesn't describe it exactly like an animal that we know in the animal kingdom. He says it's different. It's something disgusting and terrifying about this huge beast that comes up out of the earth. But it had 10 horns. So this is something that John is playing off of, as you can see, because in John's description in Revelation chapter 13, he said that this beast was really an amalgamation of all of those beasts of Daniel. He said in verse 2 of Revelation 13, he looked like a leopard, but his feet were like the paws of a bear. His mouth was like the mouth of a lion. And so you're seeing all of these things come together in this one strange sea beast. And so what could these beasts represent? Well, Daniel asks that question. In Daniel chapter 7, verse 15, he says, I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit, and the visions of my head troubled me. And I came near to one of those who stood by, and I asked him the truth of all of this, and he told me and made me to know the interpretation of these things. Now here it is in verse 17. Those great beasts, which are 4 kings which arise out of the earth. Now, here the word is kings in Daniel. Now, we'll get further insight into this. Look down in verse 23, after Daniel is asking about this strange 4th beast. The angel says to Daniel, the 4th beast shall be a 4th kingdom on earth, which will be different from all other kingdoms and shall devour the whole earth. So, I think the best way to understand verse 17 that says 4 kings is that these are kings representing their kingdoms. They are actually 4 kingdoms that come up out of the earth. And the final one, the 4th one, is the most ferocious of all and attempts to destroy God's people. And so this is understood as you go through Daniel. If you look on the screen again, I have a chart here where this represents what Daniel describes in his book. The tall metallic image on the left is what Nebuchadnezzar dreamt in Daniel 2 and Daniel interprets. But if we notice here these animals in the middle, this is Daniel 7, the lion, the bear, the leopard, and this strange, terrible beast that we just read about. Well, they all are parallel to what the statue represented in Daniel 2 and what these beasts represent in Daniel 7. And you may not be able to read it well on your screen, but the column on the right identifies those kingdoms as Babylon being the first one, the Medo-Persian kingdom being the second one like the bear, the Grecian kingdom being like the leopard, and finally, historically, what comes after Greece? Well, that's the Roman Empire. So what John is seeing coming up out of the sea is the beast of the Roman Empire. And this is in harmony with what Daniel saw, and also going to be in harmony with what Daniel saw the beast doing in persecuting the saints of the Most High. And so I think that it's important for us to know the Old Testament well enough to be able to put some of these things together. Now on your notes you're seeing basically what I've been describing in a sense. My notes are very brief and not full or anything, but that's what I've talked about in verses 1 and 2. And I even have there the chart information on your notes where the kingdoms of Babylonia, Persia, Greece, and Rome are represented by the lion, the bear, the leopard, and the terrible beasts, the terrible beast coming up out of the sea. And so I say there, obviously, the beast that John saw was indeed the Roman Empire. And it says by the end of verse 2 that the dragon gave him his power. So what is John trying to say about this beast? Well, he is going to be doing Satan's work in the world. He's going to receive his authority from Satan and his power and his whole purpose. So the Roman Empire is the immediate historical context of the readers of the book of Revelation at the end of the first century. They're going to be going through a lot of difficulty and resistance from the human government of the Roman Empire against Christianity. And this is what John sees. So again, the sea beast is the human government, particularly the Roman government in the first century, that is going to persecute God's people because, of course, it stands antagonistic to the purposes of God. And so verses 5 and 6, let's go to verse 3. And I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and its deadly wound was healed, and all the world marveled and followed the beast. We're going to talk a little bit more about the detail of what I think is going on here when we get to chapter 17, because you'll have another riddle given there that is going to give more insight into what this is. But I think what you have here is a pseudo-resurrection. In other words, it looks as if the horn or the head is mortally wounded, is killed, and yet it revives. It comes back to life, and it causes wonder and awe in the people around it. Verse 4 says, they worshipped the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, and they said, who is like the beast? Who's able to make war with him? I mean, if he can just come back to life anytime he's mortally wounded, nobody's going to be able to defeat him, right? And so they are enamored with this seemingly invincible beast, and they're worshiping his power and his miracles and so forth. This is a pseudo-resurrection. Now, if you'll remember, we talked about a pseudo-Trinity, right? An unholy Trinity. Well, the dragon would be similar, or the parody of the Father who sends the Son, right? Well, the Son is the sea beast. Well, Jesus, of course, experienced a real resurrection. The sea beast experiences a pseudo-resurrection. It looks as if he's mortally wounded, and it looks as if he's come back to life. So you're seeing this unholy Trinity play out. Now, the third person of this unholy Trinity will be the land beast, and he will be able to perform signs and miracles. And of course, in the New Testament, the Holy Spirit performs miracles in the church. And so it's really a striking parallel. Again, I use the word parody that John is seeing, because these are the forces that are coming against the effort and purposes of God in the world. And they're speaking great blasphemies, verses 5 and following. He was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. He was given authority to continue for 42 months. And we talked about that time frame next week, and you can refer to the class last week. Did I say next week? You can refer to the class last week in order to get some more insight into that time frame. 42 months, or 3.5 years, or 1,260 days. All the same time frame. But the point is that he is making war against God and his cause. Verse 6 says he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. And it was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. Now, this is similar to what we've already read earlier. For instance, Revelation 6, verses 9 through 11 has the martyrs who are killed for the cause and the testimony of Jesus Christ. And so it seems as if they are overcome, that they're defeated. And they will eventually be vindicated, but it does appear as if God is allowing them to be martyred for his own purposes and for his own glory eventually. Now it goes on to say in verse 8, all who dwell on the earth, who worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. And so these are the people who have been swayed by this beast and by the power of the dragon. The non-Christian world, those who follow the power and the world effort against God. Now there's a little doxology of sorts, verses 9 through 10. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. In other words, if you're listening to this, heed what I'm saying, John says. He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. This is the patience and faith of the saints. In other words, God will right every wrong. God will vindicate His cause. Those who fight against Him will eventually be destroyed. Those who lead into captivity will eventually be taken captive. Whoever is fighting against God with the sword will eventually be killed with the sword. All of those kinds of things. And this is the patience of the saints. So as Christians, we trust God. We trust that He will eventually vindicate His cause, deliver His people, and usher us into eternity and fellowship with Him. But in the meantime, we follow the Lamb. And the Lamb, of course, was slaughtered as well. But we have a great hope in Him. So that is the essential idea behind the sea beast. In the immediate historical context, it is the Roman Empire led by the Caesars in their antagonism to Christianity. Now, Christianity was a religio illicita. That is, it was not a lawful religion in the Roman Empire, not until the Edict of Constantine in AD 325. And so it was persecuted. Once it became clear it was separate from Judaism, it became persecuted. And we're going to see here, of course, that it actually came into a clash, into conflict with the Roman imperial religion. That is to say, part of the Roman Empire's strength and unity and solidarity was in what is called emperor worship. Now, it was a way to consolidate power under Caesar. So people had to give honor to Caesar. They had to pay tribute to Caesar. They had to burn incense and offer offerings to Caesar and call Caesar Kyrios. That's the word for Lord. And so you would have to do this in order to be a good Roman citizen. But if you were a part of a religion that Rome did not condone, then you were in pain of arrest. You were under the threat of arrest. And it could eventually lead to your death if you didn't recant your false religion and give honor and allegiance to Caesar as Lord. But that's what is going to be enforced by the land beast. That's what we're going to read about the land beast, because here's the religious component of all of this. So that's why he's often called the false prophet, as we saw earlier in the first point of your notes. He's called the false prophet because it is a religious aspect of the Roman government that enforces emperor worship. So let's read beginning in verse 11. Now I saw, he says, another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spoke like a dragon. So you already see the religious element and some echoes of Jesus' own warnings against false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they're ravenous wolves. So he looks like a lamb, but he speaks, when he opens his mouth, he sounds like the devil. Verse 12 says he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and he causes the earth and those who dwell on it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. Remember, that was his draw, is that he seems to be invincible. Verse 13, he performs great signs, so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on earth in the sight of men. He deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs, which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. So again, he's referring back to this pseudo-resurrection that's drawing people to the power of the first beast. But now he's telling them to create idols, to build images in order to worship this beast. Well, that's exactly what emperor worship was. You would go into the temple of the imperial religion in the various colonies throughout the Roman world in order to pay your taxes and pay your money and offer your incense and call Caesar Lord. Well, this is something no Christian can do. A Christian can pay taxes, but he can't call anyone Lord other than Jesus, because He is the only Lord. And so Christians were refusing to do this, and therefore they were subject to the persecution of the Roman Empire. But it says in verse 15, He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So He's performing these pseudo-miracles now, and He is therefore drawing people to Him, but those who are Christians who are not fooled by His deception are under the threat of death now, because they will not worship anyone who is not God, who is not Christ. And so this is a very difficult time for the Christians. So this here, I think, is the Roman branch of the government that enforces imperial devotion and allegiance and through emperor worship. In verse 16 it says, He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads. So He's mimicking almost everything that God has done that we've read about in the book of Revelation, where He's mimicking the Trinity, He's mimicking the resurrection, He's mimicking the miracles, and now He's mimicking the mark, where God has marked His people on their foreheads. It's the king's mark, right? The king's seal. So Jesus, in giving the Holy Spirit to those who are baptized into Christ for the forgiveness of sins, is sealing His people with the king's seal. Well, these ungodly forces are doing exactly the same thing. They're marking those who refuse to listen to the gospel and to obey Christ. They're marking them with their own seal. Verse 17 says that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. And so clearly what you have here is false religion, anti-Christian sentiment and worship that is introduced in the name of the Roman Empire and the Caesar as king over the Romans. Now, that's the unholy Trinity introduced in chapters 12 and 13. And that's the immediate backdrop of John's vision and the readers who read the book of Revelation at the end of the first century. So the rest of the book is going to show the outcome of this battle, the preparation for this battle, the outcome of this battle, and all of that. But I want us to think about some ways in which we see this even today. Now we're not told to worship the president or worship a king here in this world and all of that. So there's not exact parallels to this, but there are plenty of parallels that are inherent, I think, in the current political divide that we even have in our country between the two parties of our system. I mean, we have two parties that are on polar opposite ends of worldviews. And I think it's very important for us to think about these things. The inherent anti-biblical or anti-Christian nature of the modern progressive party in our country is something to be aware of and something to be concerned about. I don't know how any Christian can support those of that persuasion who the very planks of their party platform has to do with the exaltation of the creature over the Creator, the persecution of Christianity and biblical morality, an attack on traditional values that come from the Scriptures as far as this nation is concerned, and the direct attack on the home and on the church through the efforts and the agenda of convenience abortion, the homosexual agenda, and the attack there on marriage. I mean, these are things that we're seeing that are parallel to what's going on in Revelation 13. When you have government power brought to bear on this, and you're browbeaten into accepting these anti-Christian ideas. And in doing so, you are in essence denying the lordship of Jesus. And I think it's important for us to keep this in mind, especially in the political climate that we live in today, when we have the power of going to the voting booth, and we can cast our vote that hopefully still means something for Christianity, or at least for the principles that are behind the biblical worldview, and cast our votes for those who are much more in harmony with that than those who are in antagonism against it. And it's not a difficult decision to make when you approach it from a biblical worldview. The modern progressives worship the creature rather than the Creator. They worship Mother Earth rather than Father God. Their climate change agenda is harming humanity in order to, in their thinking, save the planet. But mankind is the apex of the created order when it comes to the efforts that should be focused on in the policies of today, should be focused on the sanctity of life, the sanctity of humanity, of men and women created in the image of God. And so we must avoid any of those kinds of efforts that we see so prominent and debated in our modern political establishment. I mean, this is a war of overarching worldviews. And if you are someone who believes the Bible, and if you're somebody who accepts what God has to say about how to view the world and its purpose and its aim and its end, then the decision is really pretty simple. I don't know how anyone could claim that a Christian is justified in voting and supporting a political party whose platform is in such contradiction to these biblical principles. And so modern progressivism and the very platform upon which that party operates is in many ways parallel to the very anti-Christian efforts of the Roman Empire of the first century. And much more can be said about that, but it is worthy of saying and worthy of our attention. Now, the last verse of chapter 13 begins one of many riddles in the book of Revelation. It's a riddle of numerology, and it's caused a lot of conversation over the centuries. It says, "Here is wisdom." In other words, it's a riddle here. You've got to try to figure this out. "Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, because it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Now the whole question is, how do you calculate that number in order to figure out who the man is? And there have been various suggestions made through the centuries, but again, if you remember from our very first class on this book of Revelation, we talked about the different interpretive frameworks that people approach the book with. And that's going to have a lot to do with how you think number 666 could be calculated. We take basically the preterist position, not the full preterist, not realized eschatology, but inaugurated eschatology. And we believe, as we've been explaining this whole class, that the Roman Empire is the primary subject of the political persecution depicted in the book. And that of course comes to an end in about 476 AD, and that would of course fulfill most of these visions in the book of Revelation. But the other is the historicist view, the historical or hysterical, as Johnny Ramsey called it, the hysterical interpretation. But that would be those who believe that it depicts all of church history from the first century till the coming of Christ. And then there is the futurist view, the premillennial, dispensational view that would say that most of the book of Revelation, chapters 4 through 22, depict really the last 7 years of human history. And that's even more hysterical than the historical view. But the point is that depending on your approach to the book of Revelation, you will interpret number 666 differently. I'm going to take the view, as I said, in harmony with the preterist view, that it either means Nero, Caesar, or it's simply purely symbolic that has to do with ultimate evil and its manifestation in a man. Now, 666 clearly is reminiscent of some of the numerology we've already talked about, where we see the number 7 throughout the book of Revelation as being a number of perfection, of holiness or purity or completeness. Well, 6 falls short of 7. That's the concept. And then the reduplication of a number, especially 3 times, shows a huge intensification. And so 666 would be ultimate in evil, ultimate in failure, ultimate in anti-God sentiment, while 777 would be on the other end of that spectrum. It would be ultimate goodness and purity and holiness and victory. Now, that is the safest way to go about understanding this. But if we were to calculate it, or as far as some Bible students have done, they can find the name Nero Caesar if transliterated into Hebrew letters. If you transliterated Nero Kaiser into Hebrew letters and you add up the value of those letters, you get to the number 666. And so it's quite interesting. I have several charts here that give some of those possibilities we've talked about. And here's the one with regard to Nero Caesar. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in close. So Nero Caesar, translated into Hebrew letters, would be the letters N, R, W, N. That's Neron. And then Kaiser would be KSR. Well, we know that in Hebrew, they didn't have numbers per se. They had to use letters that stood for a certain value. Well, if you took the Hebrew value here of each of these letters, Neron, Kaiser, you add them up. 50 plus 200 plus 6 plus 50 plus 100 plus 60 and plus 200. And clearly you add those up and you get 666. Now again, I'm not saying that's exactly what John had in mind. And as you see on the back of your notes, there are other possibilities, or at least other ways of calculating 666. But at the top, you'll see the difficulty with this particular interpretation is that there seems to be no reason to transliterate the name Neron Kaiser into Hebrew. I mean, the Romans didn't use Hebrew. And John, of course, writing in Greek. And so it's just strange. But it is equally strange that those letters do equal 666. But there are others there on the back of your notes that we see, strangely enough, equal 666. The historicist would take that the 666 would be a reference to Latinos, the Roman Catholicism. Latinos in Greek letters would equal 666. Or the Pope, the Latin phrase vicarius filii Dei was inscribed on his ordination crown, meaning in place of the Son of God. And so using Roman numerals, if you added up those letters, vicarius filii Dei, you have 666. So all of those are ways to calculate 66, but it's hard for me to believe that John had those in mind. And he certainly wouldn't have had them all in mind unless, of course, in God's inspiration, he's able to show an overlapping and an overarching repetitiveness throughout history of anti-Christian government powers that persecute the true people of God. So we're going to end Bible class there, and we will pick up in chapter 14 next week, and we'll see that we're introduced now to the protagonist. So in chapters 12 and 13, we're introduced to the antagonists, but the protagonist comes on the scene in chapter 14 and verse 1 with the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 having his Father's name written on their foreheads.